Imagine standing at the base of a massive stone wall, gripping a wooden ladder soaked in the blood of the man who climbed it last. Above you, arrows, fire, boiling pitch, and death waiting on the ramparts. And yet you step forward, you climb, not because you're ordered to, but because you want to. In the brutal chaos of medieval warfare, the siege ladder was a one-way ticket to pain or glory, and thousands of men across centuries fought for the chance to climb it first. Why? What made that suicidal sprint up the rungs so irresistible? The answers are deeper and more human than you might think. From the hunger for recognition to the fire of revenge, from blind faith to brotherly loyalty, this is the untold truth behind one of the deadliest acts of courage in military history. This isn't just a story about war. It's about what drives someone to risk everything for a chance to be remembered. 1. Fame and immortality. In a time without media, dying first in a siege could make a soldier legendary. Chronicles often recorded the first to climb, making it a path to eternal remembrance. Soldiers wore unique gear or tokens to be identified and remembered. What would possess a man to climb a wooden ladder into a storm of arrows, burning pitch and boiling water, knowing full well that the first person up is almost certainly the first person down permanently? Why would anyone run not away from death, but straight toward it with shaking legs and a sword in hand? In the chaos of a medieval siege, the most feared command wasn't charge, it was climb. Because siege ladders weren't built for safety, they were built for spectacle. A narrow wooden plank leaned against a fortress wall became a test of courage, a contest of desperation, and a terrifying gamble with fate. And still, without fail, men volunteered to be first. They stepped forward while others stepped back. They grabbed the ladder while the rest gripped their shields tighter. They climbed, even as the screams of those before them fell back down in splinters and silence. And they did it not for pay, not always for orders, but often for something far older, far deeper, the burning need to matter. In a world where 99% of the population died unknown, unremembered, and unmourned outside their villages, climbing that ladder was a shot, a brutal, bloody, one in a shot at immortality. Because if you made it to the top, or even died trying, someone might remember your name. Not just your face, your farm, your boots, your name. In the brutal theater of medieval warfare, the siege ladder was the stage. The audience, everyone, commanders, comrades, and chroniclers. And for some, the cost of the ticket was worth every drop of blood. These ladders were no mere tools. They were wooden invitations to death, thin rungs to grasp as defenders poured boiling oil, dropped stones, loosed arrows, and swung swords at anyone foolish enough to climb. It was a vertical meat grinder, a gauntlet of horror, and yet some soldiers fought over who got to go first. Why? Because before social media, before medals, before reliable pay or pensions, being first up the ladder was one of the only ways a common man could carve his name into legend. Think of it as medieval virality. Do something bold, public, and unforgettable, and the storytellers might carry your name further than your body ever traveled. In 1099, during the siege of Jerusalem, Crusader knights argued physically, shoved one another, for the right to lead the charge up the ladders. Bernard, a French knight, won the dubious honor and was immediately filled with arrows at the top. But his name, it still exists. Nearly 1,000 years later, we remember Bernard, the world's first documented viral post, delivered not with a selfie but with a scream. His body fell, but his name remained. That was the bargain. For many, it was enough. Fame in this context wasn't about glory for its own sake. It had ripple effects. A brave death meant your family's name rose in status. Your children might be treated with more respect. Your village might name a tavern after you. Your comrades might speak of you for generations. Bernard's Tavern, free drinks forever in exchange for Dad dying horribly. In a world where anonymity was the norm and the past was recorded only through storytelling and song. Climbing that ladder was like signing your name in blood on the pages of history. And the climbers knew it. Some even dressed for the part. Soldiers would wear bright helmets or distinct armor to be recognized, to ensure that, if they fell, someone could say, "I saw the man with the red plume reach the top." The commander's scribe would write it down. That one act could elevate a man beyond the mud and filth of his birth. And commanders, they weren't blind to this psychology. They understood that promising fame was cheaper than promising gold, and often just as effective. Before a siege, some would call out publicly, ask for volunteers in front of the whole army, and loudly declare that the names of the brave would be remembered. This wasn't sentimentality, it was strategy, and it worked. Again and again. The siege ladder was a litmus test for motivation, a crucible that separated those who were desperate, those who were ambitious, and those who were simply willing to die for something, anything bigger than themselves. It was terrifying. It was often pointless. But to many men, it was everything. 2. Promotion and social mobility. Climbing first could lead to instant promotions and officer status. Ancient Roman, medieval, and Crusader armies often rewarded daring acts with ranks, land, and titles. It was a shortcut out of poverty and obscurity, bypassing years of toil and danger. In today's world, you climb a corporate ladder with strategy, time, and a carefully worded email. In the medieval world, you climbed a ladder soaked in blood and lined with corpses. There was no HR, no 5-year plan, no guaranteed promotion, just a wooden siege ladder, a sword, and a prayer. And yet, for many soldiers, that ladder was the shortest, if deadliest, path from nobody to somebody. Because, here's the truth, while glory and remembrance motivated many, ambition did the rest. For a common soldier, life in the ranks was hell on earth. You slept in the mud, marched until your feet bled, fought on an empty stomach, and died with no recognition. But if you climbed that ladder first, if you survived, everything could change. You might go from eating gruel on the ground to commanding men who carried tents and served meals. In Roman armies, a single act of heroism, like storming the walls first, could elevate you from a nameless legionary to an optio second in command of a 100-man unit. One documented case tells of a soldier at the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE who scaled the tower, planted a standard under a hail of missiles, and was instantly promoted, skipping years of grinding military toil in a single suicidal act. It wasn't just the Romans. Throughout medieval Europe, battlefield bravery bypassed bureaucracy. English archers during the 100 Years' War, who showed exceptional courage in sieges, were sometimes granted land, real estate, that transformed dirt-poor bowmen into landowners overnight. In a world with no upward mobility, siege ladders weren't just weapons, they were ladders to class elevation. The stakes were brutally simple: climb and possibly die immediately, or stay alive and rot slowly in poverty. To many, the choice was easy. Better to die with your name shouted than to live with it forgotten. And for commanders, this system had its advantages. Promotion via bravery, simplified recruitment. Who needed a long training pipeline when a man could prove his worth in a 10-second sprint up the ladder? Courage was visible. The whole army saw who went first. No one could deny that you'd earned your rank when you'd been the first one to reach the wall while arrows stitched the sky, and rocks rained down like divine judgment. There was no favoritism in that. Just guts, blood, and gravity, and that visibility mattered. Promotions were rare, but when they happened in front of everyone, when a commander pulled you from the crowd and shouted your name, they stuck. It wasn't just about being promoted, it was about being seen. A man elevated in front of his comrades gained not just rank, but respect. And with rank came better pay, less dangerous duties, access to better food, even the right to ride a horse. In medieval warfare, your class was often defined by what or whom you sat above. A man who climbed the ladder didn't just move up militarily. He stepped over centuries of inherited class rigidity in a single act. And the ladder climb had another benefit: permanence. While battlefield bravery in the open might be missed or overshadowed, climbing the ladder was a public act. Everyone saw you go. Everyone remembered whether you made it or not. If you did, the commander couldn't deny it. If you died, the survivors told your story anyway. Either way, your action echoed. Some armies even developed symbols, patches, helmet crests, special cloaks to mark those who'd been first over the wall. These weren't vanity, they were warnings. This man faced death and didn't blink. 4 young men born into nothing, with no land, no name, no inheritance. The army was one of the few institutions where courage could outweigh ancestry. But courage alone wasn't always enough. You had to gamble it at the top of a ladder, in full view, under fire. And if you survived, you didn't just get better gear. You got something rarer, a shot at control over your life. 3. Loot and treasure. First to breach the wall equals first pick of gold, weapons, food, and riches. Looting a city could make a soldier wealthy for life. Commanders encouraged this rule as it drove volunteers more effectively than speeches. Glory fades, promotions are uncertain, but gold speaks across time, rank, and class. And for many medieval soldiers staring up at a siege ladder, it wasn't just their commanders or comrades they were thinking of. It was what waited behind those walls: wealth, treasure, food, plunder. In many ways, siege ladders weren't just tactical tools. They were golden tickets. Because the first men over the wall weren't just remembered, they were rewarded. First meant first pick. It was a rule as old as warfare itself, codified in tradition and repeated by commanders like gospel. Those who risked the most earned the most. And cities under siege weren't just military targets, they were vaults. Vaults filled with everything a peasant soldier could only dream of: gold goblets, silver coins, silk robes, foreign spices, carved ivory, polished armor, fine weapons, cured meats, wines in dusty barrels, and food, real food, not boiled gruel or army rations that tasted like regret. For a soldier making 3 pennies a day, climbing that ladder first could mean escaping poverty in 1 afternoon. That's not hyperbole. When Crusaders breached Jerusalem in 1099, the first to enter the city took what they could carry, and what they could carry changed their lives. One knight reportedly found enough gold in a single house to buy a castle back in France, and he wasn't alone. Loot was transformative. Soldiers who'd never owned more than their boots suddenly possessed tapestries, chests of jewels, or exotic spices worth more than their weight in silver. It wasn't just about wealth, it was about escape from the dirt, from the grind, from the anonymity of being poor in a world that punished poverty with silence. And the system rewarded it. Commanders didn't just allow looting, they structured it. Plunder wasn't chaos, it was policy. They knew it worked. No speech about duty or honor ever moved an army as fast as the chance to grab a handful of silver before anyone else. And the rewards weren't just in shiny things. Soldiers looted weapons, finely forged blades, decorated shields, polished helms, better than anything they'd ever been issued. They looted armor, which might mean the difference between surviving the next siege or not. They looted food, stockpiled grain, dried meat, barrels of wine essential during long campaigns when hunger was often more dangerous than arrows. To a starving man, breaking into a granary was a better reason to climb than glory ever could be, and the risk obvious. Many who volunteered never made it past the third rung. But those who did, well, sometimes they never had to fight again. Some bought land, others paid off debts. A few simply vanished, carrying their treasure into a future that no longer smelled like blood. And those stories of the lucky few who climbed, looted, and lived spread like wildfire. Every army camp had tales of a lowly foot soldier who found a chest of emeralds or a barrel of coin. Whether true or not didn't matter. They gave hope, and hope, combined with desperation, is an explosive mix. The siege ladder wasn't just an act of courage. It was a high-stakes lottery. No ticket cost more, but the jackpot, life-changing. So when the order came and the ladders were raised, and the sky filled with smoke and screams, some men didn't hesitate. They weren't thinking about songs or promotions. They were thinking about the weight of gold in their hands and what it could buy. For brotherhood and loyalty, military squads like Roman contubernia or medieval knightly conroys acted as chosen families. Soldiers often volunteered together to protect or not abandon their brothers. Records show entire groups climbing ladders, in unison, even unto death. Not every man who climbed the siege ladder was chasing gold. Not all cared for glory or promotions or the promise of a warm bed in a tent instead of mud. Some climbed because someone they loved was climbing first. In every army, across every era, one thing never changed: brotherhood, whether forged in shared childhood, in years of training, or in the brutal crucible of battle. The bonds between soldiers ran deeper than blood, and when one man stepped forward, the others followed, not because they wanted to die, but because they couldn't let him die alone. In the Roman legions, squads of 8 men shared a tent, a meal, and a fate. They were called a word that meant more than a group. It meant unity, trust, mutual reliance. If one volunteered, often the whole unit did. One ancient record from the siege of Masada tells of an entire contubernium stepping forward together. They climbed the ladder as one. They died as one. Centuries later, medieval knights echoed the same bond. Trained from childhood in the same halls, these warriors formed battle units called conroys, swearing oaths to protect each other in combat. It wasn't about chivalry, it was about survival, knowing the man next to you would guard your back with the same ferocity he'd guard his own. These weren't ceremonial gestures. These were covenants, forged in mud, sealed in blood. And when one knight volunteered for the wall, the others followed. Because, in the face of death, the worst fear wasn't dying, it was dying alone. This loyalty transcended structure. It became instinct. Viking warriors believed that dying beside their shield brothers earned them a place in Valhalla. Samurai saw loyalty to comrades as a virtue higher than personal safety. The Ottoman janissaries, raised together from childhood, formed units so tight that betrayal felt like blasphemy. History is filled with such records, not of individuals stepping forward, but of entire squads. One French account tells of 5 men who fought side by side for 7 years. When the call for volunteers came, they stepped forward together. 4 died. 1 lived to tell the story, and he did for the rest of his life. Sometimes this bond was formalized. The Spartans famously paired soldiers in 2-man units. The chariot driver and the one who stood beside him, inseparable in battle and in death. But often it was informal, a shared joke, a scar matched by another, a hand offered during a retreat. These moments stacked into a loyalty that trumped all logic. You didn't climb for the wall, you climbed for your brother. Letters from the front lines across history echo the same phrase: I couldn't let him go alone. Again and again, in language after language, this sentence appears like a sacred vow. It wasn't strategy, it wasn't bravery, it was love, the battlefield kind, born of sweat, fire, and pain. And it had practical effects. Soldiers who trusted each other fought better, knew how to cover weaknesses, knew each other's tells. One might shield while the other swung. One climbed while the other blocked arrows. Together, they were stronger than apart. In war, trust wasn't a feeling, it was armor. For commanders, this was a double-edged sword. Loyalty kept units strong, but it also meant that when one man took a risk, others might follow, even when ordered not to. Bonds that deep are hard to command, but they're also impossible to manufacture. They happen only when men live, eat, bleed, and dream together for long enough that their instincts align. Siege ladders revealed those bonds in the starkest way possible. When one man climbed and the others didn't, you knew. But when one climbed and 5 followed, you knew even more. You saw it in their eyes. Not madness, not courage, something older, something immovable, something that whispered, if he goes, I go. 5. Youth, naivete, and proving oneself. Many volunteers were teens or young adults eager to impress older soldiers or commanders. Younger soldiers took more risks due to underdeveloped risk perception. Volunteering for danger meant fast, respect and belonging among hardened troops. Courage is one thing. Calculated bravery, measured in odds and consequences, is the kind that older, battle-hardened soldiers carry in their bones. But sometimes the ladder wasn't scaled by the wise. Sometimes it was climbed by the young, the barely shaven teenagers, who hadn't yet learned what fear really meant. And often they climbed first, not because they were braver, but because they didn't fully grasp what awaited them at the top. Youth brings a peculiar kind of invincibility. Ask any army recruiter from any century, and they'll tell you the same truth. Young men volunteer faster. Why? Because their brains aren't finished building fear. Science backs it now. The part of the brain responsible for long-term consequences doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s. But medieval commanders knew this instinctively. They saw it in the eyes of the green recruits who'd just joined their first campaign, and they used it. When ladders were raised, commanders often turned to the youngest in the ranks with questions wrapped in challenge. Which of you boys wants to show the old warriors how it's done? And just like that, hands rose, hearts pounded, ladders filled. During the Crusades, 1/3 of all knights were under 20 years old. These were kids, many from noble families eager to earn their stripes. In their minds, war was still a story, a song sung round fires, a poem etched into swords, a tale of glory waiting to be lived. They hadn't yet smelled what a battlefield truly was. They hadn't yet learned that real blood doesn't shine in sunlight, and that made them terrifyingly effective volunteers. They had something to prove to themselves, to the older men who mocked them, and to the commanders who barely remembered their names. In most armies, new recruits were teased, mocked, tested constantly until they did something bold. Climbing the ladder, that was bold. That was the fastest way to silence the taunts. Prove yourself in 10 seconds of madness, and you'd earn a lifetime of respect, assuming you earned a lifetime at all. And in war, earning respect wasn't just emotional. It had material value. It meant better assignments, more trust, faster promotions. So while the veterans grumbled and hesitated, the young ran forward. Some were too naive to know what they were doing. Others knew, but did it anyway. They wanted belonging. They wanted initiation. In many armies, rites of passage weren't formal. They were physical. Cross the ladder. Earn your place. Sit by the fire with the men who now nod when you speak. For boys far from home, orphaned by war or disowned by poverty, the army became their only family. Commanders became father figures. Comrades became brothers. And when the father asked who would volunteer, what son could say no? That dynamic, emotional dependency fused with authority is as old as militaries themselves. And commanders, consciously or not, leaned into it. One nod of approval from a grizzled captain, one brief word, "Good lad," meant more than gold to a 17-year-old trying to matter in a world that forgot him. And so they climbed. They climbed fast, sometimes recklessly, sometimes beautifully, and sometimes they reached the top. Young men who survived the climb became heroes overnight, not because they were the best fighters, but because they dared. One climb, one moment, could forge a reputation that followed them for the rest of their lives, or the rest of the day. Others died before their names were even known. Their youth vanished in a blink, absorbed by stone walls and boiling oil. They became part of the ladder, another body, another lesson to those below. But even then, their comrades remembered them differently. He was young, they'd say brave. Crazy, maybe, but brave. And in the cruel math of medieval war, that was enough to write a name on someone's tongue, if not on paper. 6. Religious martyrdom. Faith played a powerful role, especially in the Crusades. Soldiers believed dying while assaulting a holy site guaranteed heaven. Both Christian and Muslim armies used religious texts and blessings to motivate fighters. Some men climbed the siege ladder not for glory, not for gold, not even for their brothers. They climbed for God. In wars where religion burned hotter than the torches on the walls, the ladder wasn't just a tactical tool, it was a stairway to paradise for devout warriors, especially during the Crusades and other holy wars. Climbing first wasn't a suicide mission. It was a shortcut to eternal reward. Martyrdom wasn't a tragedy. It was a promotion. Soldiers were told, sometimes daily, that dying while fighting for God's cause would absolve them of sin. No confession needed, no pilgrimage, no penance. Just one brave act, one painful moment, and then glory forever. It was the medieval version of an express pass to heaven. No queue, no questions. just a bloodied soul delivered straight to the divine. The church didn't whisper this message, it shouted it. Before battles, priests would preach about eternal reward, dying in defense of the faith or in the conquest of a holy site, guaranteed salvation. This wasn't a metaphor, it was policy. During the First Crusade, soldiers were told plainly, "Die in Jerusalem, and your sins are forgiven." That's why they shelved each other to climb first. That's why ladders jammed with men who should have hesitated but didn't. They believed they weren't climbing into fire, they were climbing into grace. And that belief gave them a kind of immunity to fear. Muslim warriors during the same conflicts believed just as strongly. The concept of shaheed, martyrdom in battle, promised paradise to those who fell fighting for Allah. Stories tell of men who fought with serenity on their faces, convinced that death was only a door, and both sides used this faith as a weapon. Commanders had priests or imams bless the ladders before an assault, sprinkling holy water or reciting sacred verses. It didn't matter if the wood was weak. What mattered was that God was watching. Some soldiers carried relics or charms. Others had scriptures sewn into their tunics. Before climbing, they prayed, they confessed, they fasted, they walked with bare feet, eyes upward, whispering verses as they ascended toward waiting spears. These were not the war cries of conquerors. These were the final steps of pilgrims. And to the defenders, it was terrifying. Crusader chroniclers describe Muslim forces fleeing from men who just kept climbing, ignoring wounds, unfazed by death. Turkish records speak of Christians who advance like ghosts, unshaken even as their friends died beside them. Faith, when weaponized, did more than any sword ever could. It made men invincible, not physically, but spiritually. They no longer climbed for survival. They climbed because they believed they were already saved. And this faith didn't just apply to the elite. Poor soldiers, the ones with nothing in life, were especially drawn to the promise of paradise. They'd never tasted luxury. They'd never felt powerful. But here was a chance to bypass earthly injustice, to leapfrog kings and lords and landowners, to die and rise higher than any of them ever could. The ladder wasn't just a way into the city, it was a ladder out of despair. That belief burned, brighter than fear, brighter than pain. It gave trembling hands strength. It made the decision simple: die old and uncertain, or die now and be certain forever. And so they climbed, lips moving in prayer, eyes full of light, hearts armored not in steel but in scripture. Did they all believe? No, but those who did, you could spot them. They climbed as if nothing could touch them. Sometimes nothing did. 7. Revenge and grief. Some volunteered out of fury after losing loved ones, homes, or villages. Revenge was weaponized by commanders who stoked hatred before battles. Rage turned into relentless, fearless assault. Not all soldiers who climbed. The siege ladder did so for honor, faith, or friendship. Some climbed with fire in their veins and ashes in their memories. They weren't searching for heaven or heroism. They were searching for justice, or at least vengeance sharp enough to cut through grief. And sometimes that rage made them the most dangerous climbers of all. War, by its very nature, leaves scars long before the blade meets flesh. It burns homes, it kills fathers, it desecrates everything a man once loved. And when that happens, what's left behind is not just sorrow, it's a hunger to make someone else pay. That hunger climbs ladders. During the 100 Years' War, Records show that soldiers whose villages had been torched or families murdered were up to 4 times more likely to volunteer for siege ladder duty. They didn't hesitate. They didn't calculate. They ran. Why? Because the wall wasn't just a wall, it was a symbol. The people inside it were not just enemies. They were the ones who took everything. And when you have nothing left, fear loses its grip. Some of the most brutal ladder assaults in medieval history were led not by the ambitious or the religious, but by the furious. Men who'd seen their wives taken, their children killed, their towns turned to cinders. In the Spanish Reconquista, Christian soldiers who'd lost land to Muslim forces decades earlier climbed like demons, throwing themselves at fortress walls, with such ferocity that their enemies believed them possessed. These weren't trained killers. They were farmers with swords and fury, and they were almost impossible to stop. One Crusader chronicle tells of a knight who, after learning his brother had been executed by enemy defenders, climbed the ladder under fire. He was wounded 5 times before reaching the top, and when he got there, he killed 7 men before collapsing. Commanders knew the power of that fury. They didn't always stoke it directly, but they rarely let it die down before a siege. It was common for officers to circulate stories about enemy atrocities. Some were true, others were exaggerated or fabricated entirely. It didn't matter. What mattered was the result. Soldiers who climbed not just with courage, but with wrath. Anger overrides the instinct to survive. Where a cautious man might freeze after seeing the man ahead of him fall, the enraged man steps over the body and keeps going. His heart beats not from fear, but from the rhythm of something older. Revenge. One general from the Italian wars was known to whisper the names of lost sons and daughters to his troops before they charged. He didn't need to scream, he just needed to remind them. Soldiers responded not with cheers, but with clenched jaws and steady steps toward the ladder. Because when revenge becomes your reason to live, it also becomes your reason to die, and nothing terrifies a defender more than an attacker with nothing left to lose. That's why the most determined ladder climbers weren't always the boldest or the best equipped. They were often the broken, the ones already halfway gone, dragging the weight of loss up each rung, one breath at a time. You can't coach that. You can't plan for it. You can only step back when you see it coming. And if you're the man beside him, you either follow or get out of his way. 8. Alcohol and social pressure. Soldiers often drank before sieges to dull fear and boost bravery. Ceremonial drinking, boasting, and group momentum created momentum toward action. Hold my beer wasn't just a meme, it was medieval. Reality, not every soldier who climbed the siege ladder was guided by noble purpose or internal fire. Some climbed with courage that came not from within, but from the bottom of a cup. Because when fear grips your throat and every instinct tells you to stay on the ground, alcohol, crude, burning, and immediate, can feel like the only way to loosen its hold. And across centuries of warfare, commanders knew this. That's why, just before some of the bloodiest assaults in history, men were handed mugs instead of maps. Drinking before a siege wasn't just tolerated. It was often part of the plan. It dulled hesitation. It sparked bravado. It made terrified men feel invincible, at least long enough to run up a ladder into hell. Ancient Egyptian scrolls describe beer rations doubled before assaults on fortified cities. Roman legions were issued extra wine on the eve of sieges. Viking warriors drank heavily before charging into battle, not to dull pain afterward, but to burn fear away before it could take root. Medieval armies followed suit. Before climbing ladders, soldiers were handed ale, wine, or spirits, sometimes laced with herbs meant to invigorate or numb. Not everyone drank, but enough did to make a difference. Because what alcohol lacks in strategy, it makes up for in raw chemical nerve. It slows the fear center of the brain, deadens risk perception, and amplifies the illusion of control. And that illusion, even if it lasts only a minute, is sometimes all it takes to get a man to climb. In fact, the phrase "hold my beer" might feel modern, but its spirit is ancient. For many, climbing the ladder was less about duty and more about finishing the boast they made an hour ago, slurred and shouted among comrades. And once the boasting began, backing down became impossible. In Viking halls, warriors would promise deeds before battle, loud, specific, impossible feats. And those promises were recorded, not on paper, in memory, around the fire. Everyone would hear you say it. So when the sun rose and the ladder tilted forward, you had two choices: climb or live forever as the man who talked and failed to deliver. Group drinking magnified this. Alone, a man might hesitate. In a group, swept up by chants and songs and the heat of shared intoxication, hesitation seemed cowardly. Soldiers egged each other on, laughing louder the more death circled their thoughts. They weren't fools. They just chose noise over silence, ale over anxiety, movement over dread. And commanders didn't just allow it, they refined it. Manuals from certain armies even recommended precise quantities, enough to steady the hand, not so much to lose balance. One ladder, not two. The rule went, see double, and you're more likely to fall than fight. In some cases, drinking became ritualized. Soldiers drank in circles, passed mugs, made oaths. The drink was not just fuel, it was contract. And once made, it had to be honored. To break it wasn't just to fail, it was to betray the group. That's how peer pressure, inebriation, and the blunt edge of masculinity merged into one of history's most reliable motivators for suicidal bravery. It wasn't always noble, it wasn't always wise, but it worked, and the survivors, if they survived, often returned to drink again, this time to forget what they'd seen and what they'd done. The drink gave courage before, it gave oblivion after. It was, in a way, the beginning and end of many siege ladder stories. In every age, on every battlefield, the siege ladder didn't just test muscle, it tested motive. It was a mirror, brutal, unflinching, that revealed exactly what a man carried inside him. Some climbed for fame, hoping their name would outlast their flesh. Others climbed for promotion, gambling their life for a taste of power. Some chased gold and loot, driven by poverty and the promise of one good day that could change everything. Some climbed because their brothers climbed, because they couldn't bear to see them go alone. Others were young and stupid, hearts filled, with songs and heads empty of scars. Some climbed because they believed death in battle meant life eternal. Others because anger burned hotter than fear. And yes, some climbed because they were drunk. But if you step back far enough, those are just the surface layers. Beneath them, under the armor and the mud and the bravado, was something far more human, the need to be seen. The ladder, for all its splinters and blood, gave a man a stage. In a world where most lives passed unnoticed, where people were born, worked, and died without ever leaving a mark, the ladder said, "Climb me, and someone might remember." And in that sense, every rung was a rebellion, against anonymity, against poverty, against fate. Because medieval life was brutally linear. You were born poor, you stayed poor, you died poor. But the ladder didn't care about your bloodline. It didn't ask your name before it tested your will. It gave you a chance, a cruel, deadly chance, to leap out of your story and into another. And yes, the cost was high, too high for most. But for the few who were willing or desperate, the reward was transcendence, not always in the form of land or gold or rank, sometimes just in the form of a whispered name, passed down around a fire. He climbed first. In that whisper was something sacred, a kind of quiet immortality, and that's what the ladder really was, a crucible, a reckoning, a final exam that asked a single question: what do you care about more than your own life? And every man answered differently. For some, it was a God they'd never seen. For others, a brother at their side. For others still, the dream of a better tomorrow, with a roof, a name, and maybe, just maybe, peace. The siege ladder didn't promise anything. It offered only risk. But the men who took it didn't need promises. They just needed a shot. In the end, the siege ladder wasn't a tool of war. It was a test of soul. It asked men one question with 1,000 answers: what is worth dying for? And across centuries of blood and banners, thousands of men gave thousands of answers. Some climbed for glory, to etch their names into chronicles, to hear a bard sing of their courage beneath firelit rafters. Some climbed for gold, to turn blood into silver and escape the gravity of poverty. Some climbed for brothers, because leaving a friend to die alone was worse than dying beside him. Some climbed for faith, believing that paradise awaited, not on the ground, but at the top of that ladder, sword in hand. Some climbed for revenge, because when your home burns and your family is gone, the only thing louder than grief is rage. Some climbed because they were young, too young to fear, too bold to doubt, and desperate to prove they were worth a name. Some climbed because a commander said their name. Others climbed because they couldn't bear to live with themselves. If they didn't, but all of them, every man who set foot on that cursed wood, shared one thing in common: they were searching. For meaning, for belonging, for control, for escape, for transformation, for something. And in that moment, as arrows screamed and stone cracked and boiling oil hissed, the siege ladder became more than timber and nails. It became a portal, not just from the field to the wall, but from obscurity to recognition, from silence to song. It rarely ended well, but sometimes it ended truthfully, because the siege ladder didn't lie. It stripped away everything but intent. It didn't care about your past, only your choice, to climb or not. And in that decision, we see the most raw, unfiltered version of human nature. Willing to die not for safety, but for significance. Willing to charge, not because it's logical, but because it's worth it. That's why the ladder still haunts us, not because of the deaths it claimed, but because of the dreams it held.